Growing up in the message, there is no question that we focused on history. In the sermons we listened to, in our study, even in the conversations we had, past events had much higher value than current events. They weren't the historical events that were taught in schools, however. These were the events that only a message believer would know and cherish. They were the events in the life and times of the prophet. We wanted to learn a little bit more about the prophet. We wanted to know what he liked so we could like it too. We wanted to know what he disliked so we could dislike it as well. We especially wanted to know what he strongly opposed, because in the message, if the prophet opposed something, we could rest assured that God had told him to oppose it, no matter what it was. I remember how strange it was when our family migrated across the country and attended message churches in different regions. Churches in the South weren't familiar with all the rules for the churches in the North. Churches in the West weren't familiar with all the rules for the churches in the East. Each message pastor had his own idea of what the prophet disliked and would preach against it with the authority of the prophet's recorded statements. Some had known the prophet personally and had spoken with the prophet and claimed that they had inside knowledge as to what the prophet stood against. One pastor out west felt it was his sworn duty to preach against ladies wearing open-toed shoes. For this pastor and his congregation, any message-believing woman who opened her toes to another man was nothing more than a prostitute. You can imagine the surprise when message-believing women from the East visited their church wearing open-toed shoes, or when the women of his congregation visited their relatives in other parts of the country. These women had no idea that they were prostituting themselves. Personally, I grew up with a natural curiosity that went far beyond other message believers. I wanted to know more than just what to like and to dislike. I wanted to know why I should dislike it. In my worldview, God, the prophet, and the entire world around us were like intricate gears in the timepiece of eternity. The prophet's history was just as important as his message. The life that he lived and the choices that he made were all part of a greater plan. There were many rules that we followed as message believers that other Christian churches were not aware that they needed, from avoiding radio or television to very specific grooming and dress code, to relationship conduct and more. Many of the rules were not found in the Bible, and we were privileged to have them. His reasons, if not based on the Bible, must have been part of God's greater plan. I knew that plan included a trip out west and a return to Jeffersonville, but when I learned that William Branham was preaching with Roy Davis in Louisville, I wanted to know why. How did this information fit into the plan? I knew that I could spend years studying Louisville history, and that history would have been fascinating. Louisville, Kentucky was a key part of many significant historical events. But after learning that William Branham followed Roy Davis from Louisville to Jeffersonville, I became curious to know more about the Reverend Roy Davis. Why did he leave Louisville to come to Jeffersonville? He had already established his church in Louisville. Compared to Jeffersonville, Louisville had much more opportunity for a growing church. I decided it was time to focus my research on Mr. Davis. I came across an interesting article in the archives of the Courier-Journal. A letter to the editor claimed the writer had done a thorough investigation on Roy E. Davis. The author of the article proposed a debate with Roy Davis the same year he ordained William Branham, the same year that Davis was criminally indicted by a grand jury. If one researcher could find information on Davis before the internet, I would surely be able to find it using the power of technology. Since I was relying solely upon documented history, the easiest way to trace Roy Davis was backwards through time, starting with the facts that I currently knew. I knew that Davis was indicted for bringing an underage girl to Louisville from Chattanooga. and that he had been accused of doing the same with other girls in other states. Therefore, Tennessee was the best place to start digging for information on Roy Davis. Tracing his steps backwards, I found Roy Davis arrested in 1929 in Nashville, Tennessee. In Tennessee, Davis had used the same strategy of including the word Baptist in the name of his Pentecostal assembly that he used for churches in Louisville, Kentucky, and Jeffersonville, Indiana. People in Tennessee were surprised to see the pastor of the Pentecostal Baptist Church, Roy E. Davis, threatening an opponent with a concealed weapon. That is not the way of a pastor of a church, and not the way that he would normally behave. In 1925, I found that Roy Davis had made national news for his after-church activities in Tennessee. The Lead Daily Call in South Dakota published an article about Roy Davis due to his unethical practices in a fraternal organization he was attempting to establish in Tennessee. Davis was a royal ambassador of the Knights of the Flaming Sword and was holding frequent membership drives to recruit others to join this white supremacy group. Imperial Wizard William Joseph Simmons, the founder of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan, had been banished from the Georgia-based white supremacy group and was attempting to start a rival organization. The formation of the Knights of the Flaming Sword was an attempt by Davis and Simmons to recreate the Ku Klux Klan with a different name and attract members from his original creation as new recruits. Davis used his pastoral authority to claim religious significance for white supremacy. According to Davis, Simmons was likened to Moses, which was fitting for the strategy of the organization. Like the biblical leader of the Exodus from Egypt, Simmons was attempting to start an exodus out of the Ku Klux Klan. Davis symbolically tried to make the claim that the Knights of the Flaming Sword organization was the Promised Land, while the Ku Klux Klan was Egypt and should be left behind. This strategy, however, appeared to be one solely motivated by personal gain, which attracted the attention of the news media. According to the Associated Press, Simmons and Davis were taking people's money while accumulating millions of dollars for themselves. In the early 1920s, before the Indiana Klan became dominant within different sects of the Ku Klux Klan, the original 1915 Ku Klux Klan was in complete disarray. William Joseph Simmons and 15 charter members had started the white supremacy group in 1915 with what purported to be good intentions. But after the group was accused of being terroristic, Simmons found himself at the center of a federal investigation. Georgia Congressman and fellow Klansman William Upshaw successfully offered up a defense in Washington, D.C. to prevent a government shutdown of the organization. But for Simmons, the damage was complete. State leaders of the Ku Klux Klan decided to appoint new central leadership, and Simmons was ousted. Even from its inception, the 1915 Ku Klux Klan was recognized for its terroristic nature. The group prided itself on its creation of vigilantes hell-bent on enforcing laws that local, state, and federal law enforcement could or would not enforce, including laws that were not widely accepted or based on the United States justice system. These vigilantes were especially militant against Catholics, African Americans, and Jews in the South. Since members operated under the disguise of a white hood, it was difficult to know who among the citizens was one of the vigilantes and who was not. They became known as the Invisible Army. Enforcing laws that had no judicial boundaries, however, led to violence. If there were no guidelines for the laws to enforce, then there were no guidelines as to how they should be enforced. Some members of the Ku Klux Klan joined the organization because they believed in white supremacy and harbored hatred against different races and began torturing and killing those that they hated in order to cleanse the nation. Worse, since the Ku Klux Klan was established under the guise of a Christian organization, these terroristic members were performing religious cleansing, United States government officials and Ku Klux Klan leaders alike feared the consequences of a holy war, and it was clear that under the leadership of Simmons, the Klan's image would be tainted in the eyes of the government. When Simmons was banished from the Ku Klux Klan that he created, those members who wanted the holy war became unhappy with current leadership. Simmons, furious for having been ousted, retaliated by attempting to steal members from the organization he created to become new recruits. I knew that if Simmons chose Davis as a royal ambassador for his replacement group, the Knights of the Flaming Sword, the trail of Davis's history would likely lead to Georgia. Simmons must have known Davis personally. I began searching newspapers from 1915 to 1925 throughout the state of Georgia for anything mentioning Roy E. Davis. The search for Davis in Georgia was more successful than I would have ever imagined. I suddenly stumbled onto a goldmine of information for Davis, enough to accurately describe the character of the prophet's first pastor, and what could have possibly been a motivation for the prophet to choose Davis's church over others in the area. According to the Associated Press in 1923, Davis was an official spokesperson for the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the Klan's public defender. Davis started a newspaper in Georgia, the Brickbat, to teach Klan principles. I found that he was the head of the Georgia Farmers Union and that he was fired from that position for living a dual life. The Macon, Georgia newspaper ran an article about some Texas justice action against Davis, who was at the time going by the alias of Lon Davis, short for his middle name, Elonza, and pastoring a Baptist church. Lon Davis was whipped with a wet rope for abandoning his wife and child in Texas to live with another woman in Georgia. The story made big news throughout the South when it was discovered that the preacher named Lon was the same Roy from the Georgia Farmers Union and the official spokesperson for the Ku Klux Klan. In Texas, Davis was also making headlines. Reverend Lon Davis of Georgia was a convicted felon from Texas. When members of his Georgia church began to investigate his past, Davis used the strong, threatening arm of the Klan to retaliate. Ku Klux Klan meetings were held at Davis's church, and when the deacons of the church objected, Davis handed Deacon H.M. Williams a threatening anonymous letter from the Klan. In 1917, Reverend Roy E. Davis went to prison for bank fraud in Texas. He and his brothers were involved in stealing money from the Boonesville Bank in 1916, and after a series of coincidences, Roy Davis was arrested. While he was going by the alias of Lon in Georgia, a lady recognized him. She had met him while visiting family in Texas and attending a revival held by Roy Davis. When she recognized him in Georgia, she noticed that he had a different wife than the one that she recently met in Texas. Davis's dual life included dual wives, multiple ministries, multiple churches, and one single lady from one single camp meeting in Georgia brought him down. This was not the image that I had in my mind when I thought about the prophet's first pastor. Did Davis's Louisville and Jeffersonville churches also host meetings of white supremacy? Were his sermons loaded with principles of the Ku Klux Klan? Was the prophet, who was an active minister in Davis's church, attending these secret meetings? These questions led me to think about some of the prophet's very negative statements about civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King and President John F. Kennedy. The prophet said that the election of President Kennedy was one of the greatest mistakes that the colored race ever made. I began to wonder how much Davis's principles influenced the prophet. I decided it was time to focus my research back to Jeffersonville. If Davis had left a trail of criminal activity leading through several states, there was a good chance that his criminal activity continued in Jeffersonville. I found a series of articles in the Jeffersonville Evening News from October of 1930 describing a huge gospel tent at Warner Park near Spring Street in Jeffersonville. Perhaps in an attempt to sway public opinion concerning his character, Roy Davis held several revival meetings claiming to be a converted licensed spiritualist medium who converted to Christianity and began to expose the tactics used by mediums and spiritualists. These meetings were very successful and attracting large crowds who begged the evangelist Davis to continue and pledged donations using pledge cards. Local Jeffersonville pastor and former mayor's son Ralph Rader joined the tent revivals and continued working with Roy as the meetings outgrew the tent and began using the Jeffersonville Knights of Pythias armory instead. During the meetings, it was claimed that Miss Belle Eakin was healed of being crippled. The next year in 1931, newspapers described the aftermath of those meetings. Jeffersonville newspapers in 1931 described Roy Davis helping his brothers migrate from Texas to Jeffersonville to hold another revival. These were the same brothers involved with the bank fraud in Texas, and they were now in Jeffersonville helping Davis and the prophet grow a church, one that practiced healing. I learned that Roy Davis had also set up a publishing company in Jeffersonville, and that he was trying to force the evening news into using descriptions that he himself created for his church services as if their reporters had written them. The newspaper refused to print his stories, unwilling to let Davis embellish the truth. Suddenly, I stumbled onto the information that I was looking for in the 1931 archives. On September 25, 1931, Governor Sampson of Kentucky ordered that Davis be extradited to face charges. Davis had fled Louisville to avoid charges of defrauding members of his church, which would explain why Davis started the Jeffersonville, Indiana church, in which the prophet worked as an assistant pastor. Governor Leslie of Indiana agreed to let Davis be remanded to the custody of Kentucky officials, and the newspaper report went on to explain how Davis managed to gain a congregation after abandoning the one that he left. The article stated that Davis became a choir leader for Reverend Ralph Rader, and that Rader terminated Davis unexpectedly. Davis convinced several members of Rader's congregation to leave Rader's church, after which Davis started a church community in Jeffersonville. His church was on Watt Street between Chestnut and Maple. Ralph Rader was related to Paul Rader, the author of the song Only Believe. It was a song that was very special to us in the message. It was the prophet's theme song. If the prophet was preaching with Reverend Roy Davis from 1930 while Davis was in Louisville, and then followed Davis to Jeffersonville after criminal prosecution, and continued as Davis's assistant pastor while Davis stole a large portion of Ralph Rader's congregation, it was safe to assume that the prophet was fully aware of Davis's background. It was also likely that Only Believe was a popular song in Davis's church, before the prophet had used it for his own. His congregation came from Ralph Rader's church. I began to wonder, what did the local religious community think about Davis and the prophet? Stealing another minister's congregation, criminal allegations about living with underage women, defrauding members of the church, extradition to Kentucky. The list of reasons why anyone should flee Davis's church was too long to count. The prophet was at the center of a nationally publicized mess. It was time to dig deeper into the transition from Davis's Pentecostal church to the prophet's first church in Jeffersonville, Indiana. If Davis's immoral and criminal activities did not convince the prophet to leave Davis, then what did?